The night was polished to perfection. Inside the ballroom of the West Bridge Tower, a crystal chandelier caught the golden light and scattered it like fragile stars across the glass walls. Applause thundered, champagne flutes clinked, and somewhere near the orchestra, a woman in a backless gown whispered to her partner, "That's Nathaniel Cole, the Nathaniel Cole." He stood at the center of it all, tall in a sharp midnight blue suit, silver cufflinks gleaming against the cuffs of a life meticulously crafted. He looked the part every inch of him. The tech mogul, the visionary, the man who'd built Colgenics from a garage prototype into one of America's most potent medical innovation firms. But a man elsewhere was behind the eyes that held the room gray, unreadable, steady. He raised his glass for the cameras, smiled when required, and made the kind of speech that would trend by morning. Brilliant, hopeful, curated. But when the lights dimmed and the crowd turned to laughter and jazz, Nathaniel slipped away to the private lounge upstairs away from the crowd and the celebration. He sat alone in the dim hush of expensive leather and city lights. Not in pain, exactly. Not in peace, either. He reached into his blazer's inner pocket and pulled an old photo. Faded, soft at the edges. A woman in a simple white dress, smiling like summer itself, one hand resting on her belly. And just like that, the applause below faded. Her name was Amara. 10 years had passed, and he still couldn't say it out loud without something catching in his chest. It should have been different. He should have been beside her that day. He should have never sent that message. He had built an empire with precision and ruthlessness contracts, shareholders, global impact, but he had shattered a family with 6 words on a screen. I have to choose legacy. At the time, he'd believed it. Legacy over love, name over need, silence over truth. And yet, here he was, surrounded by the spoils of success power, prestige, perfection, and haunted by the single photo he'd never dared to frame. He closed his eyes. He could still hear her laugh if he let himself remember. Still feel her fingertips tracing dreams across his skin on nights when nothing else made sense. He had tried to forget. Lord knows, he'd tried with work, women, ambition, and achievements stacked higher than the skyscrapers he owned. But regret has a way of surviving applause. It waits, quietly, faithfully, until one night, at the height of everything you once wanted, it walks back into the room and says, "Is this really what you gave it all up for?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stared out across the city. Somewhere out there, maybe not far, was a woman who had carried his child in silence, and 3 children, triplets, whose names he didn't even know. He whispered her name, like a prayer. He wasn't sure he still had the right to speak. Amara. No matter how well designed, the room around him no longer held meaning. Success wasn't supposed to feel like this. Legacy wasn't supposed to feel like loss. And yet here he was, Nathaniel Cole, who had it all, sitting in a penthouse built from brilliance, wishing he could go back to a porch in Chicago, barefoot and warm, where a woman once read books to him in the quiet of dusk, and where love had been a choice he didn't dare to keep. If you've ever wondered what it means to lose the love of your life truly, or whether a man like Nathaniel deserves a second chance, keep watching. The story that unfolds is not just about regret, it's about redemption. And if it touches your heart, even a little, leave a like. Share your thoughts in the comments, and follow this channel for more stories that remind us. Sometimes, love isn't lost. It's waiting, just beyond the silence. It was in Chicago, 10 years ago, on a day so ordinary it should have been forgettable. The spring wind carried the scent of rain through the courtyard of a small university library. Ivy curled lazily up the red brick walls, and students passed in slow motion, heads bowed into books, earbuds tucked in, laughter echoing faintly off the stone walkways. Nathaniel Cole was not supposed to be there. He had been scheduled for a board meeting downtown, something with venture capitalists and early-stage biotech pitches. But the meeting had been pushed last minute, and on a whim, or perhaps something more instinctive, he wandered into the campus grounds he hadn't set foot on since his early 20s. And that was where he saw her. She sat beneath a dogwood tree, papers spread across a faded quilt, her voice rising and falling like music as she read aloud to a group of local children seated in a semicircle on the grass. Her tone wasn't theatrical. It was quiet, steady. But every child was riveted wide eyes, slack jaws, as if the words came not from the book, but from a place deep inside her. Amara James. He didn't know her name then. All he knew was that something about her presence disrupted the rhythm of his breath. She was not the kind of woman that magazines placed beside men like him. She wasn't polished to a high shine, and didn't move like she was performing for a crowd. There was something grounded in her. Her beauty was not loud, but it was unmistakable. And her voice. It lingered long after the words stopped. He stayed until the children left. He hadn't meant to. But he found himself standing there, suit jacket over his arm, just outside the tree's shadow, as she packed her things into a canvas tote bag. She looked up and met his eyes without flinching. "You've been standing there a while," she said. "I didn't want to interrupt," he replied. That never stopped most people. That was the first thing he noticed about her, her refusal to flatter. She wasn't charmed by money, power, or the glossy sheen of his tailored life. She didn't ask what he did or what he drove. She wondered what he read when he couldn't sleep, what he feared. Who had disappointed him? They began meeting once a week, then twice, then, without keeping count. He would bring espresso, and she would bring stories, fragments of Black history, oral traditions from the South, women whose names had been buried in footnotes and deserved to be remembered. She was writing her doctoral thesis on African American matriarchal legacy, and she spoke of it with such fierce clarity, it made him feel like a child again, eager, unsure, enthralled. He had never met anyone who made him want to listen more than speak. They walked the city like it was theirs alone, down underpasses splashed in mural paint, through bookstores that smelled like worn paper and rain, across parks where street musicians played jazz under dusk-colored sky. It wasn't fast, their love. It was something slower, quieter, more dangerous because of it. She didn't know who he was, not at first. Not the son of Clarice Cole, the sole heir to one of the country's most aggressive healthcare dynasties. Not the man whose last girlfriend had been handpicked for him at a private fundraiser in D.C. She only knew Nathaniel, his middle name, the one he used when he wasn't being watched. He wanted to stay in that illusion longer than he should have. But secrets have short lives. When she finally found out, she didn't cry. She asked, "Was it me you were hiding? Or you?" He didn't have an answer then. But she stayed. Even after she knew the truth, she stayed. They built a space outside expectation, late-night takeout on her fire escape instead of gala dinners. Notes scribbled in the margins of books instead of texts read between meetings. She made him laugh, not the careful kind reserved for investors, but the belly-deep, breathless kind that cracked something open. She didn't try to fix him. She saw him, and he loved her for it. Their wedding was so quiet that it felt like a shared secret, a small garden in Bronzeville. A friend of hers who was a poet officiated. No press, no rings worth photographing. Just two people making a promise that felt bigger than the ceremony. He remembers how she smiled that day, soft, as if she knew joy could be fragile, and held it like something precious. And then, life pressed in. The board caught wind of the woman from the south side. The media began sniffing around. And Clarice, as always, knew before he could tell her. She didn't yell. Clarice Cole never raised her voice. She sipped her drink and said, "You'll choose. You always do." He told himself he wouldn't. He told Amara he wouldn't. And yet, day by day, the pressure mounted. Investors asked questions masked as concern. Mentors reminded him of optics. Strategists began subtly excluding him from decisions. There were whispers in the corridors of the company his father built and his mother preserved. He's slipping. He's distracted. Then, one afternoon, Amara met him at the lake's edge near her apartment. She was wearing his favorite blue sweater, which didn't quite fit. Her hands trembled when she took his, and in a voice so small he almost didn't hear it, she said, "We're having a baby." He didn't speak at first. He couldn't. Then she added, with a shaky smile, 3 of them, triplets. The word echoed in his head like thunder. He kissed her forehead. He said all the right things. But inside, something ancient and terrified rose, not shaped by her, but by years of being told what love could cost. And that night, under the sterile glow of his corner office, with the skyline behind him like jagged glass, he made a decision that would haunt him for a decade. 6 words, typed in silence, sent without a signature. "I have to choose legacy." He didn't watch her reply. He couldn't. Because for all his power, for all his precision, Nathaniel Cole had never learned how to stay where love asked him to. And when he walked out of her life, he didn't just lose her. He lost the only version of himself that had ever truly lived. The rain arrived before dawn. It wasn't dramatic, just a soft, unrelenting hush pressed gently against the window panes, like a reminder that something was ending, even if the world hadn't noticed yet. Amara stood by the small kitchen sink of her apartment, folding a cotton baby onesie she had picked up from a thrift shop near Hyde Park. It had faded stars along the hem and a button missing at the collar. She held it with both hands for a long time, running her thumbs across the worn seams, imagining which of the 3 heartbeats inside her would one day wear it first. The kettle behind her whistled. She didn't move. Her phone lit up on the counter, screen glowing with a message. Just one. No greeting, no explanation. Just 6 words. "I have to choose legacy." At first, her brain refused to absorb it. She stared at the letters, as if they belonged to someone else's story. Her hands tightened, not out of anger, but to keep from trembling. She reread the message, then again, and something inside her shifted, not shattered. No, not yet. That would come later. What came first was a quiet, a silence so heavy it bent the air around her. He hadn't called, he hadn't come, he hadn't, no goodbye, no voice. Only a sentence typed with cold precision, as though the months they had built together, the promises, the porch lights left on, the whispered plans of a life far from the boardroom, had been scribbled in pencil and erased without care. She placed the phone face down on the counter. She didn't cry. Tears would come later, but not now. Not while the sky was gray, and her body still carried 3 tiny souls who didn't yet know heartbreak. She couldn't afford to fall apart, not yet. Instead, Amara moved through her morning with quiet choreography. She packed a small duffel, books, clothes, prenatal vitamins. She tucked the wedding photo between 2 folded sweaters. It wasn't for sentiment. It was because someday, when her children asked what their beginning looked like, she would need proof that it had once been beautiful. She didn't leave a note. She didn't call her friends. She turned the key one last time and stepped into the rain, The cab driver didn't ask questions. She didn't offer any. They rode in silence through the waking city, past the cafe where Nathaniel had once waited with cinnamon buns, past the mural she had helped paint in the summer before the twins' heartbeat split into three. It was all still there, unchanged, as if the universe hadn't noticed what had been broken. The train station smelled like steel and wet newspaper. She bought a one-way ticket south, no destination in mind, only distance. As the train pulled out, she rested her hand on her stomach and whispered, "You still have me." It was the only promise she could keep. Willow Creek wasn't where she planned to end up. It wasn't on any map of dreams she'd once drawn. But the small Georgia town, tucked between rivers and pine trees, welcomed her not with curiosity, but with quiet understanding. The kind of place where neighbors didn't ask why a young woman arrived alone, 7 months pregnant with tired eyes and no ring. They saw how she walked purposefully, even when her steps were uneven. They saw how she talked to her belly in the grocery store line, as though she were narrating a world her babies couldn't yet see. And so, the town responded the only way it knew how. Gently. A local schoolteacher helped her find a rental, an old cottage on the edge of a magnolia grove, its porch sagging and its shutters needing paint. But it had a working stove, a bathtub deep enough for comfort, and a skylight above the small bedroom that caught the moonlight just right. She moved in within the week. The night the triplets arrived, the power went out. A late spring thunderstorm had rolled over the hills, knocking out the lines before the ambulance arrived. But the midwife, a sturdy woman named Ruth, with hands like oak roots, kept calm. She lit candles, boiled water, and said, "This isn't fear, honey. This is life demanding its entrance." Nia came first, eyes wide, lungs quiet. She blinked like someone who had seen too much before birth. Miles arrived next, slow to cry. But when he did, it was a sound of mourning and wonder intertwined. Then Ezra, loud and full of motion, as if he had grown impatient in the womb and couldn't wait another second to make his presence known. Amara held them one by one, their skin warm against hers, their tiny fingers curling instinctively around her thumb. At that moment, Nathaniel's absence became irrelevant. These were her children, her rhythm, her reason. She was no longer alone. She was a mother, and that made her powerful. The early years passed in a blur of exhaustion and grace. She learned to make formula in the dark, to rock 3 babies at once with her body folded like a prayer, to sing lullabies when the power went out, and to tell stories of ancestors who had crossed oceans with nothing but faith and fire in their bones. She didn't speak of their father, not in bitterness, not in pain, only in silence. She answered without flinching when the children grew older and asked where he was. "Somewhere out there. Maybe you'll meet him someday." She never said his name, because she had chosen, from the first moment of their birth, that their story would begin not with abandonment, but with strength, with survival, with the knowledge that love, when rooted deeply enough, could grow even in the ruins. And in that quiet town, where nothing much ever changed, Amara changed everything. She built a life not from what she'd lost, but from what she refused to let go of. Dignity, purpose, and a love so fierce no longer needed a name to be real. There's a quiet area that only small towns know how to keep. It was the kind that blanketed Willow Creek in the early morning hours, before the bakery doors opened, the school bells rang, and the sunlight fully stretched across the cedar-lined roads. A quiet that didn't ask questions, didn't press for stories, but allowed you to breathe without performing. Amara had learned to live inside that quiet. She became a fixture of the town not by force, but by presence. Every Saturday morning, she set up a folding table at the Willow Creek Community Center, telling local history through forgotten voices, women who had marched without headlines, children who had written songs never recorded, elders whose memories held entire neighborhoods no map would ever show. She didn't ask for recognition, but people noticed. They noticed how her eyes lit up when she spoke about memory, how she taught children that history wasn't what lived in textbooks, but what survived in kitchens, in lullabies, in the way you walked down a street your grandfather once built with his hands. They noticed how the triplets, now toddlers, moved through the town like they belonged. Steady and curious, Nia often sat in the front row during Amara's talks, legs crossed like a tiny scholar. Miles preferred to observe from corners, clutching a sketch pad and drawing whatever caught his eye. Ezra was rarely still, darting between shelves at the library, greeting strangers like old friends, laughter trailing behind him like sunlight skipping across water. They were different from the other children, not just because they had no father at drop-off or because their mother didn't own a television, but because they moved with a kind of steadiness, as if they had been built in the eye of a storm and had learned to carry calm wherever they went. But even the calmest children eventually asked questions. It started small. A drawing of a family, missing one figure. A book about astronauts, where a child pointed and said, "That's what I'd tell my dad if I had one." Amara had braced herself for this day. She had rehearsed words in her mind for years. But when Nia finally looked up from her cereal one morning and asked, "Did Daddy ever hold us?" nothing in her could pretend it didn't ache. She reached across the table, brushing a crumb from her daughter's cheek, and said softly, "He didn't know how to stay. But that doesn't mean you weren't worth staying for." The children didn't ask more that day, but the silence between them shifted. At night, when the house grew quiet, the dishes were washed, and the laundry folded in neat, stubborn stacks, Amara would sit on the old porch swing she had repaired, the same one that creaked just enough to sound like memory. She'd hold the wedding photo in her lap, which she hadn't shown anyone, not even the children. Not because she was ashamed, but there were some truths too heavy for a child to handle. She traced the outline of Nathaniel's jaw, his hand resting on her waist, the sunlight catching in the curls she had worn loose that day. He hadn't smiled fully in the photo, but she remembered what he whispered in her ear moments before it was taken. "This doesn't feel like running." She had believed him. But love, she'd learned, wasn't always about what someone says in the soft light of promise. Sometimes, love fails. Not because it's false, but because it's afraid. And his fear had cost her everything. Still, she couldn't bring herself to hate him. There had been enough loss already. Instead, she carried the photo the way one holds a scar not to reopen, but to remember what healing had cost. Time passed the way it always did in Willow Creek, slowly, then all at once. The children grew. Nia's voice became thoughtful, deliberate, as though she weighed each word before offering it. Miles began crafting elaborate stories in his notebook, filling page after page with imagined worlds. Ezra, still uncontainable, turned every corner of the house into an obstacle course. But at night, he was the first to crawl into her lap and ask for one more story. Amara never remarried. Not because she couldn't, because she wouldn't offer anyone half of herself. And maybe though she wouldn't admit it out loud, not because her heart was still waiting, but because it never really asked permission to close. She built a life, not just for the children, but for herself. She was invited to guest lecture at local colleges. The mayor asked her to curate the city's bicentennial exhibit. A grant she co-wrote funded a preservation initiative that brought scholars and artists from across the state. People called her Dr. James. They said her name with respect. But even on the most accomplished days, when the children hugged her tight and her inbox overflowed with praise, there remained a room inside her small, locked, quiet, where the echo of his voice still lingered. Sometimes she'd dream of him, not in the way she had once been, full of longing and sweetness. Now, he appeared in fragments, watching from a distance and holding a book, offering tea he never used to drink, listening instead of speaking, always just watching. And when she woke, her chest would feel like it had been carrying something too long. One evening, while folding laundry, Amara found Ezra staring at her phone, scrolling through photos. "Who's that?" he asked, stopping at a blurry image of her on the porch, taken years ago. She smiled. "That was me, a long time ago." "Before us?" "No," she said, kneeling to meet his eyes. "You were always with me, even before you were here." He nodded, satisfied with the answer, and darted away, his toy spaceship clutched in his hand. But her heart didn't settle as easily, because lately, she had felt it. A shift, a breeze not quite familiar, as if something was approaching, not dangerous, but not peace either. A weight in the air, like the moment before the sky changes. She closed the laundry room door gently, and for the first time in years, she whispered his name out loud quietly, as if unsure the walls were ready to hear it again. Nathaniel. The name didn't hurt the way it used to, but it didn't leave softly either. Because some ghosts don't haunt. They wait. And she had the feeling this one was no longer waiting from afar. In Manhattan, mornings were designed to feel like conquest. The skyline was always first to wake, glass towers stretching skyward like sharpened blades, each pane reflecting ambition. Elevators hummed to life before sunrise. Coffee cups were gripped like weapons. And Nathaniel Cole, he wore silence like armor. On the 27th floor of Cole-Ginix's global headquarters, the office light flickered on long before the rest of the city blinked awake. Nathaniel stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, not looking out, but staring through his reflection. The city behind him moved fast, but his gaze stayed fixed on the version of himself staring back, flawless suit, uncreased tie, the faint silver at his temples now more defined. He had built a life around precision. And yet, lately, his hands trembled. Not constantly. Only when he was alone. Only when the noise receded and memory stepped in. This morning, a small drawer tucked away behind contracts and annual reports betrayed him. Inside, a faded envelope, unlabeled, unsent. He opened it with careful fingers, revealing a sonogram image he hadn't looked at in nearly a decade. 3 shadows. 3 beginnings. The image blurred as his eyes refused to compose. He sat down, elbows on his knees, the weight of the past somehow heavier now than it had been the day he walked away. For years, he had told himself she would be fine, that Amara was stronger than he was, that she didn't need him. But time had betrayed that comfort. It hadn't dulled the ache. It had deepened it, etched it into him like rain-worn stone. She had carried his children, and he had disappeared into duty. Now, nearing 40, with accolades stacked like museum relics and a public image polished to gleam, all he could think about were the years he'd missed. The first cries, the first steps, the first time someone had called her mom with the certainty of belonging. And not once had he been there. He pressed the image gently against his chest, as if it could echo a heartbeat that once was his to hear. When the Willow Creek expansion proposal landed on his desk, no one knew its relevance but him. It was presented like any other strategic initiative, rural integration, innovation outreach, and community partnerships. But when he saw the location Willow Creek, Georgia, his entire body paused. He didn't speak, didn't delegate. He said, "I'll go." No one questioned him. He was the CEO after all. But the truth lay quieter. He wasn't going for business. He was going for a glimpse of what he had lost. Not to be forgiven, not even to be seen. To know they were real, and that the life he once abandoned had continued anyway. Willow Creek unfolded like a memory half remembered. The plane landed in Atlanta. The car ride south was quiet, pine trees rolling past in soft waves. The air changed the moment the highway gave way to back roads, thicker, warmer, humming with something older than steel and glass. He arrived just after dusk. No entourage, no announcement, just a man in a rental car, driving past weathered storefronts and modest porches bathed in amber light. The town moved slowly. Children on bikes wove between dogs napping on sidewalks. Neighbors waved not out of politeness, but out of habit. It was a place where people still paused to talk about the weather, or the garden, or a pie cooling in a window. It was also a place where no one knew his name. And that anonymity felt like a strange kind of mercy. He didn't ask for Amara, didn't search her name. He simply observed. He found the community center first, a small brick building covered in vines and surrounded by benches carved with names. A mural stretched across one side, children beneath a canopy of oaks, laughter frozen in brushstrokes. In the corner, painted with quiet dignity, stood a woman holding an open book. Her likeness was unmistakable. Amara. Not young, not untouched, but radiant in a way no photograph had ever captured. A plaque beneath read, "To the voice that taught us our past and shaped our future, Dr. Amara James." He stood there for a long time. Something in his chest unraveled. She hadn't just survived. She had thrived. Not with glitter or applause, but with substance, with work, with a grace he had once been privileged to witness and had been too afraid to stand beside. He returned to his hotel in silence. Didn't unpack. Didn't sleep. Instead, he sat by the window, eyes tracing the lines of a town that had become home to the family he didn't know. The thought that his children might be sleeping somewhere nearby, unaware that the man they had never met now stood just miles away, hollowed him. But it also did something else. It moved him. And in that movement, a decision was settled. No more watching from behind the glass. He would find her, not to reclaim, not to beg, but to understand, to truly see the life he had chosen not to live. And perhaps, if the door wasn't already closed, to knock gently and wait. Because some stories, no matter how long delayed, deserve to be heard by both sides, even if they don't end where they once began. The morning he saw her, the world had no idea it was holding its breath. The sun had risen gently over Willow Creek, casting its familiar hush over the sidewalks and storefronts. Dew clung to the petals of the dogwoods like secrets not yet told. The town moved with its usual rhythm, unhurried, content, almost tender in simplicity. Nathaniel stood outside Mason's Corner, a small cafe on the square's edge, hand resting on the worn brass door handle. He'd passed it 3 times that week, lingering near the window before walking away with an ache he couldn't name. But that morning, something in him shifted. Not courage, he wouldn't call it that. Perhaps it was surrender. The weight of waiting had grown heavier than the fear of being seen. So he stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed a soft, familiar sound that tugged at something buried. The cafe was quiet. Only a few patrons hunched over newspapers, the scent of vanilla and cinnamon wafting from behind the counter. His eyes scanned the room, almost instinctively. And then, he saw her. She was seated near the window, where the light pooled golden across the floorboards. A notebook lay open beside a cup of steaming tea. She wore a simple blouse, sleeves rolled to her elbows, and her hair was pulled into a loose knot that had begun to unravel. One strand had fallen forward, brushing her cheek, but she hadn't moved it. She looked peaceful, but not untouched. There was weight in her posture, the kind that comes not from defeat, but from endurance, like a woman who had carried too much for too long and learned how to make that burden look graceful. Nathaniel forgot how to breathe, because 10 years had passed, and yet his body remembered her. Her shape or voice, and the silence she once carried when the world turned too loud. At the table with her sat 3 children. 3. A girl, about 9, sat upright, reading quietly, one hand holding the edge of the book as if she were anchoring herself to the words. A boy sat beside her, tracing lazy spirals onto a napkin, lost in some thoughtful fog. And the youngest, a boy with curls too wild to be tamed, was mid-joke, his eyes lit with mischief, laughter bubbling up from somewhere bottomless. Nathaniel's breath caught. There they were, the echoes of his face in miniature. He didn't need a DNA test to tell him who they were. Amara looked up, and for the first time in a decade, their eyes met. She didn't gasp, didn't flinch, didn't reach for her bag or her phone. She looked at him, as if he were someone she'd once known in a dream she had decided not to revisit. "Nathaniel," she said softly, not with warmth, not with anger, just a name, spoken like a fact. His legs moved before his mind could intervene. Each step toward her table felt like walking across years, across choices, across regret. "I didn't expect," he began, but the words crumbled. She tilted her head, brow raised slightly. "You didn't expect to see your children?" The cafe around them remained unchanged, mugs clinking, barista steaming milk, a spoon stirring sugar in the background. But at their table, time folded in on itself. The youngest boy turned first, eyes wide with curiosity. "Mom," he asked, "who's that?" Amara placed a hand gently on his shoulder, grounding him. "This is someone we used to know." The girl studied Nathaniel closely. "He looks like Miles," she said, pointing to the boy tracing circles. Miles blinked and looked up, then tilted his head. "Why are you crying?" Nathaniel hadn't noticed the tears, but they were there, sliding down without ceremony, without control. He dropped to one knee, not out of dramatics, but because it felt wrong to stand above them. "I'm your father," he said quietly, "and I know I don't deserve this moment, but I needed to see you." No one moved, but no one turned away either. Amara looked at him, not as the man who once left her, but as the one now trying to return. She stood. "We should talk," she said. "Not here." They walked silently through Willow Creek's old park, the triplets trailing behind them, their voices a soft chorus in the background, bickering over whose turn it was to carry the sketch pad, wondering if they'd pass the playground. Amara led him to a bench beneath an old oak tree, its branches wide, generous with shade. She sat, legs crossed, hands folded loosely in her lap. He sat beside her, but not too close. She didn't look at him right away. Instead, she watched the children chase each other through patches of sunlight. "I don't want apologies," she said. "I want honesty." He nodded, throat tight. "I came for the expansion project. That's the official reason. But the truth..." He paused. "I've thought of you every day since I left. Every deal I signed. Every award. None of it replaced what I lost. "And now what?" she asked, her tone even. "You want redemption? A second chance? A redo?" He looked at her then, not pleading, but with something raw. "No," he said. "Just a beginning." She finally turned to him, not with softness, not yet, but with something else, something closer to recognition. "They ask about you," she said. "They don't say it outright, but I see it in their eyes when other kids talk about dads. I tell them the truth, that you're far away. I don't lie, but I don't tell the whole story either." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I don't expect forgiveness, but if there's anything I can do, anything, I want to earn a place in their lives, and maybe, one day, if it's not too late, in yours." She studied him in silence. The children, still nearby, were pretending to be explorers now, climbing the tree's roots, inventing missions with laughter. "They come first," Amara said at last. "If they trust you, maybe I'll learn to trust you again too." And then, without waiting for an answer, she rose to her feet, calling the children toward her. Nathaniel remained seated, watching them gather, watching the wind catch strands of her hair the same way it used to. He had imagined this moment 1,000 ways, but he had never imagined it would begin like this. Not with a grand gesture, but with 3 children, and a bench beneath an oak tree, and a woman who had learned how to carry everything he once feared and survive. The first days after their meeting moved like syrup, thick, uncertain, and strangely quiet. Nathaniel didn't leave Willow Creek. He didn't make declarations. He didn't ask to see the children again the next day. He stayed. Every morning, he walked the curved sidewalks of the town like someone relearning how to breathe without being followed by headlines. He stopped at the general store for coffee, nodded to the same dog that slept outside the post office, and wandered past the community library, where Amara sometimes held storytelling sessions under the magnolia tree. He watched, not in secrecy, but in reverence. It was a strange reversal. He, once the man who was always seen, now found solace in becoming invisible. And she, the woman once left behind, now held a presence that quietly ruled the pulse of this town. Amara did not make things easy. She didn't invite him to dinner. She didn't let the children spend time alone with him. But she didn't shut the door either. There were minor signs, fragments of softness woven into caution, like the way she didn't move when he lingered after conversations, or how her voice lowered not cold, but guarded when she spoke his name. It was Miles who asked the first real question. One afternoon, they were outside the school, waiting for the carpool line to inch forward. Nathaniel had offered to stay with them, unsure if it would be welcomed. But Amara had looked at him, shrugged slightly, and said, "It's your turn." Miles stood beside him, hands tucked into the pockets of his canvas jacket, eyes squinting at the sun. "Did you always know about us?" he asked. The question didn't come with an accusation. It came like curiosity sitting too long in a child's chest. Nathaniel crouched to meet his gaze. "I knew about you," he said softly. "All 3 of you, before you were born." Miles studied him, serious beyond his years. "Then why didn't you come?" Nathaniel didn't answer right away. Not because he didn't have one, but because for the first time, the truth mattered more than the excuse. "I was scared," he finally said, "and selfish, and I thought walking away would protect everyone from the mess I was." Miles didn't nod, didn't speak. He looked away toward the school gates, where Nia was waving at them from the courtyard. But later that evening, when Amara asked what the children had said, Miles only replied. He told the truth. Ezra was different. He didn't ask questions. He didn't wait for answers. He watched Nathaniel with wide eyes and unfiltered interest, like a boy who couldn't decide if this tall stranger was a magician, a liar, or both. One day, as they walked from the community center, Ezra suddenly sprinted ahead and leapt from a low stone ledge, landing with a thud and a laugh. "Did you see that?" he shouted. Nathaniel chuckled. "That was impressive. Bet you can't do it." Nathaniel eyed the ledge. He was wearing slacks and shoes far too formal for jumping off stones. But he backed up, ran awkwardly, and launched himself over the edge, landing with far less grace, but just enough commitment to make Ezra laugh until he wheezed. That evening, Ezra told Amara, "He's not boring." And from Ezra, that was high praise. But it was Nia who held out the longest. She didn't ask questions. She didn't run. She observed carefully, quietly. It was as if she were trying to decide whether this man was a chapter worth writing into her carefully kept notebook. Nathaniel noticed how she watched the way he tied his shoes. She paid attention to the way he talked to strangers. Whether he said, "please" and "thank you," whether he let Ezra win, or whether he corrected Miles when he used the wrong word. Then, one afternoon, after a community cleanup where Nathaniel had spent 3 hours pulling weeds under a blazing sun beside Amara, Nia approached him with a folded paper. "I made you something," she said. Inside was a drawing charcoal, carefully sketched of the mural at the community center. But this version had 4 children beneath the oak tree. 3 were clear, and the 4th was a shadow. "You can be in it," she said, "if you stay." He didn't speak. He couldn't. Instead, he knelt, held the paper like glass, and whispered, "Thank you." It was not acceptance, not yet. But it was a beginning. At home, Amara watched these moments with a kind of cautious stillness. She didn't smile when Nathaniel made Ezra laugh. She didn't soften when Miles sat beside him in quiet companionship. But her eyes followed, and her hands paused mid-motion when Nia spoke to him without being asked. She had built this life carefully, every choice deliberate, every boundary earned. Letting him near it again wasn't as simple as forgiveness. It was an act of risk, and love, she knew better than most, was always a gamble. One evening, as the children played in the front yard, Amara stepped onto the porch and stood beside Nathaniel without a word. He handed her a cup of tea he'd picked up on the way over. She looked at it, then back at him. "Still cinnamon vanilla?" she asked. He nodded. "I never stopped drinking it." She took the cup, didn't drink, but didn't hand it back either. "Why now?" she asked. He didn't pretend not to understand. "Because everything else felt loud. And this, you, they were the only thing that ever felt like quiet." They stood there in silence, not uncomfortable, just unspoken. And in that hush, between a porch swing and a chipped ceramic cup, something fragile and unnamed began to stretch its limbs again. Not love, not yet. But the permission to believe it might still be possible. And sometimes, that was the hardest thing of all. The first time Nathaniel stood alone at the edge of Amara's front porch, he didn't knock. He just listened. The sounds spilling softly through the windows were both ordinary and devastating. Ezra's unfiltered laughter bouncing through the hallway, the clatter of dishes being dried, the low hum of Amara's voice reading something aloud, her tone steady and unhurried, as if time had finally learned how to move around her rather than through her. It wasn't a performance. It was a life. And he was only now realizing just how much he had missed. The porch light flickered once before glowing to full brightness. A moth bumped against the bulb. The evening was warm and quiet, the kind of Georgia dusk that felt like it had soaked through your skin when the stars came out. He knocked. Not loud, not long, just enough to be heard. A moment later, the door opened, and there she was. No makeup, an old cotton tee knotted at the hip, her hair wrapped in a patterned scarf. She wore the same way she always had when she was tired, but wouldn't admit it. "You're early," she said. He nodded. "I wasn't sure if I'd change my mind if I waited. You still could. Then I won't give myself the chance." She didn't step aside. Not right away. But she didn't close the door either. Instead, she turned and called into the house. "He's here." 3 sets of footsteps thudded down the hallway. Ezra got there first, socks sliding on hardwood, hair wild, carrying a half-assembled Lego spaceship. "Can we show him the project?" he shouted, breathless. Miles followed, quieter, but his eyes were bright. Nia brought up the rear, arms folded with a seriousness far older than her age. 5 minutes, Amara said, stepping back. And just like that, he was in. The living room was warm and worn, with a mixture of soft lamps and half-sunken cushions, stray crayons under tables, and folded blankets draped like memories. There was a scent in the air, lavender maybe, or something citrusy, and a stillness that didn't feel stiff. It felt lived in. It felt like a place held together by love in the absence of luxury. Ezra pulled him toward the dining table, where an elaborate school project was mid-construction. Papier-mâché planets hung from a coat hanger bent into the shape of a solar system. Each planet had been labeled in colorful, sometimes misspelled handwriting. "Mine is Jupiter," Ezra announced, "because it's the biggest." "Miles did Saturn," Nia added. "I did all the organizing, research, and color coding." Nathaniel leaned closer. "It's beautiful. It's due tomorrow," Miles said, "but we're not done with the poster part yet. Can I help?" There was a pause. 3 pairs of eyes looked at Amara, who stood just at the kitchen threshold, leaning against the doorway. She didn't nod. She didn't smile. She just said, "Only if you take instructions." For the next hour, Nathaniel sat between glue sticks and glitter, careful not to speak too much or too little. Ezra kept interrupting to change the positions of the planets. Miles asked if Saturn had rings that moved. Nia rearranged labels 3 times, before deciding the font didn't matter if the meaning was correct. Amara moved in and out of the space, refilling lemonade glasses, wiping glue off the table, and handing over string and tape without being asked. Every motion was effortless. Every motion reminded him of who she used to be and who she had become without him. At one point, Ezra turned to him and asked, "Do you know any constellations?" Nathaniel smiled. "A few. Which one's your favorite?" He paused, then looked across the table at Amara. "Orion," he said softly. "It always felt like someone standing guard." Ezra nodded, as if that was the correct answer. "We should make that next." When bedtime came, the children protested, as children always do. Amara didn't argue. She raised an eyebrow, and the rebellion deflated without a word. Nathaniel helped gather the scraps from the table, folding newspapers around half-dried pieces of the universe. "You can stay," she said suddenly, not looking at him. "For a while. If they ask." He straightened. "Are you sure?" "No," she said, "but I've made peace with harder things." She leaned against the counter, arms folded, tired but composed. He wanted to ask what she had thought during all those years, whether she'd imagined this moment, whether he had been hated, mourned, or erased. But he didn't. Instead, he said, "Thank you." Not because it was enough, but because it was the only honest thing he had left to give. Later that night, after the children had gone to sleep, Amara found him outside on the porch. She handed him a mug of tea, cinnamon vanilla, the same as always, and sat beside him. They didn't speak at first. The stars above them pulsed softly. Somewhere, A cricket hummed its one-note lullaby. The porch swing creaked under their shared weight. She sipped, then asked, "Did you ever think about fighting for us?" His fingers tightened around the cup. "Yes," he said, "but I didn't know how to fight without losing everything else. And I was too much of a coward to realize that losing everything would have been worth it." She looked straight ahead, then nodded. "I raised them alone," she said. "But I never told them they didn't have a father. I only told them you were far away because I wanted them to form their idea of you, not inherit my disappointment." Her voice didn't waver. It never had. But something beneath it trembled. Nathaniel turned toward her, gently. "And what about us?" She let the question hang there. Then, she answered it the only way she knew how. One step at a time. He exhaled slowly, and for the first time in years, the porch didn't feel like a threshold he wasn't allowed to cross. It felt like a beginning, one wrapped in silence, but not in distance. Willow Creek had never been a place for spectacle. It preferred the slow reveal of character, change, and truth. It was a town where stories traveled not through headlines or social media. Still, by the subtle rhythm of front porch conversations, the raised eyebrow of a shopkeeper, the nod of acknowledgement passed quietly between old friends in the produce aisle. And now, it had something new to murmur about: Nathaniel Cole. No one said his full name at first. He was simply the man who came back, the one who parked his car not at the inn like most visitors, but in front of the cottage with the teal shutters, the one that belonged to Amara James. He didn't walk like someone passing through. He walked like someone trying to remember how to stay. At the bakery, he waited in line like everyone else. He helped Ezra pick out strawberries at the farmer's market, even though the boy preferred peaches. He held doors open, paid in cash, and thanked people by name. Some folks were suspicious. Others were curious. But most just watched, because watching was its wisdom in Willow Creek. No one said anything when he started showing up at school pickup, when he began volunteering on weekends, repainting the benches in the community park with Miles, or restocking shelves at the library where Nia spent her afternoons, categorizing books by mood instead of genre. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud. But slowly, the edges of his absence began to blur. One Saturday, during a town-wide cleanup, he arrived early, sleeves rolled, toolbox in hand. Most people brought gloves and trash bags. He brought drills, extra screws, and the quiet patience to fix what had long been ignored: loose boards, creaking hinges, the forgotten railing outside the senior center. Amara found him kneeling beside a warped fence post, adjusting a leveler with careful hands. "You always fix things this quietly?" she asked. He looked up, face streaked with sweat and sawdust. "Only when I'm scared of breaking them worse." She didn't reply, but she handed him a bottle of water and sat down beside him. They worked side by side until noon, exchanging a few words. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it had settled into something familiar now, a language they both understood better than speech. Afterward, they sat on the tailgate of someone's old pickup, sharing leftover biscuits and watching Ezra teach Miles to skip stones across a muddy patch that barely qualified as a creek. "They're different with you," she said, almost to herself. "I'm different from them," he answered. She looked at him then, and for the first time in years, it wasn't a glance shaped by memory. It was one grounded in the present. A moment later, Nia ran up, breathless, her notebook in hand. "I'm doing my school project on oral histories," she announced. "Ms. Levitt said we should interview someone who remembers important things." Nathaniel smiled. "I'd love to help." She shook her head. "I meant Mom." He laughed genuinely, unguardedly. And Amara, despite herself, smiled too. That evening, they found themselves back on the porch. The children were inside, half asleep in a pile of books and pillows. The air was thick with late summer warmth, which lingered on your skin even after the sun had gone. Amara sat cross-legged on the swing, one hand curled around her mug. Nathaniel leaned against the railing, watching the fireflies blink their silent stories across the yard. "They trust you," she said. He turned. "Do you?" She took a long sip before answering. "I don't know yet, but I no longer feel I have to protect them from you." He nodded slowly. That was more than he had expected. "You're still careful with them," she added. "They deserve that." "So do I," she said, voice quiet, but sure. He looked at her then, not as the woman he had once failed, but as the one he had spent every day since trying to be worthy of again. "I know." There was a long pause, and then she asked the question that had been living at the edge of every glance, every guarded breath since he returned. "What are you going to do when people start asking?" It wasn't about the town. It was about his world, the one he had once chosen over her, the one with cameras, headlines, and the mother who had never approved of her existence. "I don't have a script for that," he admitted. "Good," she replied, "because I'm not something to be explained. I know that now." She finished her tea and stood, brushing her fingers along the porch railing, not looking at him. "Then, make sure when the time comes, you remember that." He watched her disappear into the house, the screen door creaking gently behind her, and he was left alone with the hum of crickets and the weight of a future he wasn't sure how to protect, but knew, without question, he would no longer abandon. Days turned into weeks. The children began using the word "dad" in casual ways, not dramatic ones, when asking for help with math, offering a piece of cookie, and pointing across the soccer field. Amara didn't correct them. She didn't encourage it either. She observed, measured. One afternoon, while packing groceries into the trunk, Nia slipped her hand into Nathaniel's without saying a word. They stood like that for a full minute, watching the sky roll with the promise of distant rain. He didn't speak. He didn't need to, because trust, in her world, wasn't built by declarations. It was built like this, quietly, steadily, held in the small acts that no one saw. Later that week, a reporter called. Not from a local paper, but a national outlet. Word had spread. Photos had surfaced. The reclusive CEO spotted in a small southern town. Rumors swirled. Was he sick? Retiring? Scouting expansion? He didn't respond. Not yet. But he knew the moment was coming. The moment when the world would ask for a version of the truth it could package. And this time, he would not offer them a lie, because the story wasn't his alone anymore. It belonged to a woman who had rewritten the meaning of grace, to 3 children who had learned to love without being taught, and to a town that had shown him what legacy looked like: soft, enduring, stitched in small kindnesses and second chances that no headline could capture. The reckoning was near. But for now, on a porch that once felt like a threshold, Nathaniel sat beside Amara, beneath a sky peppered with stars. And neither of them spoke. Because some evenings didn't ask for language. They asked you to stay. It came on a Wednesday, the kind of overcast day where the sky seemed undecided, the kind that carried the smell of distant rain and the tension of something inevitable. Amara was in the kitchen, slicing apples for Ezra's afternoon snack, when the first message came in, from a former colleague, then another, and then the voicemail from Marcus. Her hand stilled mid-slice. She didn't need to open the links to know. Nathaniel stood on the porch, not yet inside, shoulders tight as if he too could feel the shift in the air. When she opened the door, he was already turning toward her. "I was going to tell you," he said softly. She said nothing, just stepped aside, letting him in without a word. Inside, the children were upstairs. The house smelled faintly of rosemary, and something baking a scent so warm and ordinary, it made the conversation waiting in the room feel even heavier. Nathaniel handed her his phone. The article was already open. Billionaire CEO Nathaniel Cole, reportedly living double life in small Georgia town. A subheading followed. Mystery woman and children, possibly linked to past scandal. There was no photo of her. But there would be. Eventually. The comments were already filling in the blanks. Speculation, criticism, pity wrapped in judgment. 1,000 people who didn't know her name, drawing lines around her life, as if it were theirs to define. Amara didn't flinch. She returned the phone and walked to the sink, rinsing her hands without urgency. "What are you going to do?" she asked, eyes fixed on the window. "They're calling for a statement," he said. "The board's nervous. My mother's furious. I'm not surprised. I haven't said anything yet." She turned then, leaning slightly against the counter, crossing her arms with a calm that was anything but detached. "Then don't say anything about me. Or them." "I wasn't going to," he said quickly. "Good. Because I don't need protection if it comes with a narrative." Her voice was quiet, but cut like glass. "You still don't get to choose how this plays out, Nathaniel. Not again." He swallowed. "I'm not asking to, but I don't want you blindsided." "You already blindsided me," she said, not cruelly, but honestly. "You did it 10 years ago. And you did it again the day you walked into that cafe without warning." Her words settled like ash, not to destroy, but to mark what had already burned. He took a slow breath. "You're right, and I can't change that. But I can make sure I don't hide again." She didn't respond, only watched him. Her silence neither forgiveness nor refusal. Just the truth, held steady. Then Ezra's footsteps pounded down the stairs, dragging the moment with them. "Mom!" The oven beeped. Amara turned, brushing a hand against her scarf. "Check if it's brown on top," she called. "Okay," came the reply, muffled and cheerful. She turned back to Nathaniel. Her expression hadn't softened, but something had loosened, like a door cracked, not yet open, but no longer locked. "I have a meeting tonight," she said. "The town council wants to finalize the community grant. Can you stay with them?" "Of course. And no gifts, no promises, just presence." "I understand." She nodded once, walked past him, and up the stairs without another word. After that, he stood in the center of her kitchen for a long time. Her warmth still lingered in the room, but so did the weight of what was coming. After the children had gone to bed that evening, he returned to the porch with Marcus. His brother had driven down unannounced, like always, when things got too quiet. They sat with mugs in hand, feet propped on the railing, the porch light buzzing above them like a lullaby out of tune. "She's going to be dragged into it," Marcus said eventually. "You know that." Nathaniel nodded. "Have you talked to Mom?" "She left 3 voicemails in a row. None of them is polite." Marcus exhaled. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to tell the truth. That's not exactly a corporate strategy. It's the only one I haven't tried." They sat in silence again, listening to the hum of night insects and the distant sound of someone's wind chimes swaying gently in the breeze. Then Marcus asked quietly, "Do you love her?" Nathaniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched the house behind him, the soft flicker of light beneath the children's door, the quiet rhythm of life that had carried on without him for a decade. "Yes," he said finally, but this time I don't want to say it until it means something. Marcus nodded. Then make it mean something. The next day, Nathaniel flew to New York. He walked into the boardroom with no script, prepared statement, or intent to preserve what had always demanded his silence. He stood before the men and women who had once taught him how to measure value in quarterly growth, and he said simply, I left someone behind, and now I'm trying to be worthy of returning. He didn't defend. He didn't posture. He told them about Willow Creek, about Amara, about the children who had never asked for anything but the truth. Some board members were horrified. Some were quietly moved. Vivian, his mother, didn't speak during the meeting, but she waited for him outside, her pearl earrings glinting like weaponry. You've thrown everything away, she said calmly. No, he replied. I've finally chosen something that matters. She stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away. He didn't follow. Back in Willow Creek, the town watched too, but differently. They didn't gossip with malice. They didn't approach Amara in pity. Instead, someone left sunflowers on her porch. A baker sent home an extra loaf. Her friend Marcy from the library took her hand one morning and said, You don't owe anyone anything. Amara didn't cry. Not even when she saw the footage of Nathaniel's press conference. She didn't cry because there was no relief in it, only confirmation. That maybe the man he was now wouldn't have walked away from her back then. That evening, he returned. No headlines followed him, just dust on his boots and a heart worn thin from trying to do right. She opened the door before he could knock. He looked at her, unsure of his permission to seek, but she didn't speak. Instead, she stepped aside. And this time, he didn't hesitate. It wasn't a grand return. There were no candlelit reconciliations, no dramatic silences broken by confessions. The world did not pause for him when Nathaniel stepped through the doorway that night. The air smelled faintly of rosemary and fabric softener. Somewhere upstairs, a faucet dripped with the casual rhythm of a house lived in, not performed for. Amara didn't say a word. She handed him a folded blanket and pointed to the couch. And somehow, that was more intimate than anything else could have been. Nathaniel slept lightly that night, not because the sofa was uncomfortable, but because his body hadn't yet learned how to rest in a place he didn't think he deserved. In the middle of the night, he heard footsteps, small ones. Ezra padded into the living room, sleep-heavy and mumbling. Bad dream. Nathaniel sat up, instinctively reaching out. Do you want me to take you back to bed? Ezra shook his head, climbed onto the couch beside him, and curled up without another word. They stayed like that for the rest of the night. Ezra's soft breathing pressed against his side, and the quiet echo of a life he hadn't built, yet had somehow returned to. In the morning, Amara found them still sleeping, the blanket half kicked off, sunlight streaking across the room in slanted gold. She didn't wake them. She just stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary before turning to make breakfast. The rhythm of their new days was cautious, but steady. Nathaniel didn't ask for more than was offered. He didn't try to force his way into rituals already formed morning routines, lunchbox notes, Sunday pancake batter whipped just the way Naya liked. He showed up. When asked, he walked the children to school and went through Ezra's endless retelling of science facts. Listened to Miles read aloud from a book about ships he could barely pronounce. Helped Nia find the right words for her school essay when she didn't know how to begin. He kept his phone face down, took calls only when no one was listening. He no longer chased silence in luxury. He found it now in the ordinary paper glue stuck to his fingers, mismatched socks on tiny feet, Amara's half-hummed melodies as she folded laundry. One Thursday evening, after a late meeting at the community center, Amara found the children sprawled across the living room floor, coloring, Nathaniel sat among them, pencil in hand, carefully sketching a dragon that Ezra had insisted should have 6 wings and eyebrows of fire. The sight stopped her, not because it was picturesque, but because it was unguarded. A man who used to run from chaos was now learning to sit inside it, to breathe inside it, to stay. Later that week, Amara stood beside him in the kitchen, the sink full of dishes, the children upstairs brushing their teeth. They worked in silence, their shoulders occasionally brushing as they passed plates, cups, and pans with the quiet intimacy of people who had finally stopped avoiding each other. "I spoke with the principal today," Amara said, drying a bowl. "She asked if you'd be interested in volunteering for the STEM club." Nathaniel looked over, surprised. "Did you suggest to me?" she asked. "I didn't say no." He paused, then nodded. "I'd like that." "She said Ezra talks about you a lot. Says you're good at explaining things." "That's only because he's better at asking questions than most grown men I know." She smirked, not quite a smile, but something close. "You're good with them," she said. He met her eyes, dish towel in hand. "I want to be." Her gaze didn't waver. Wanting isn't the same as doing. "I know." She turned back to the dishes, her voice lower now. "They trust you more each day." He waited. "There's still a part of me that doesn't," she finished quietly. He didn't rush to answer, didn't try to fix it. Instead, he stepped beside her, took the next wet plate from her hands, and dried it. Not as a gesture of redemption. Help. They stood like that for a while. The water is running. The porch light flickered beyond the kitchen window, the edges of their lives slowly stitching themselves together without the need for declarations. Sunday came, and with it the town fair. Willow Creek never did things big, but it did them wholeheartedly. The school lawn became a maze of homemade booths, lemonade stands, handmade jewelry, second-hand books, quilts that had taken months to finish, now draped over tables in sun-faded pride. The children were beside themselves with excitement. Ezra begged for cotton candy before they even parked. Miles clutched a $5 bill like it was a treasure map. Nia had signed up to sing one verse of a community folk song and nervously hummed it under her breath for a week straight. Nathaniel held Amara's hand as they crossed the field, not because they had discussed or planned it, but because her fingers had brushed against his and neither had pulled away. They didn't talk about what it meant. They just walked, together. When Nia stood on the makeshift stage, her voice caught slightly at the first note. Nathaniel watched from the crowd, his breath held as she glanced at him. He didn't mouth anything, didn't nod. He just held her gaze steady, proud, still, and that was enough. She found the note, sang it clear, and when the applause came, she ran straight to him, threw her arms around his middle and said, "Did I sound okay?" He held her tight. "You sounded like yourself." That night, after the children had collapsed in a pile of sugar and sunburns, Amara joined him on the back steps. The fair had left the house slightly sticky balloon ribbons half deflated in corners, a forgotten bag of kettle corn resting on the counter. But the air was calm again. Crickets chirped in easy rhythm. The sky stretched wide and dark and clean. "I've seen you change," she said. He didn't respond, just waited. "I don't think you came here expecting to stay," she continued. "But you did." He looked at her then, eyes soft. "I didn't expect to be allowed." She reached for his hand, fingers brushing the scar at the base of his thumb, a wound he had gotten in college and always said was from learning the hard way. "Don't confuse grace with forgetting," she said. "I don't. But you've earned something." She didn't say what. Didn't need to, because the way she leaned her shoulder into his, the quiet pressure, the wordless offering was more than enough. And sometimes, in the long, slow hours between regret and redemption, A gesture like that was the closest thing to peace he'd ever known. It happened on a Tuesday, one of those brittle autumn afternoons when the wind picks up in unexpected gusts, rattling porch railings and stealing hats off children's heads. The sun was soft but scattered, filtering through half-turned leaves that hadn't yet made peace with the season. Amara had been running late. She usually walked the children home herself, liked the rhythm of their small feet on the pavement beside hers, the way they took turns talking over each other, filling her in on every mundane detail of their day. But that afternoon, a last-minute parent meeting at the community center had dragged longer than expected, and Nathaniel had offered gently, not insistently, to pick them up instead. When she got home, the door was ajar. Not wide, just cracked. The kind of detail a mother notices before anything else. And then she heard the crying. Not frantic, but sharp. Fractured. Her heart dropped even before her feet started moving. She found them in the kitchen. Nathaniel was on the floor, one hand pressed to his knee, the other trying to calm Ezra, who was sobbing in panicked hiccups. Miles stood frozen by the sink, pale. And Naya was gripping a kitchen towel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. What happened? Amara's voice was low, too even. Ezra looked up first, face blotched and streaked. It's my fault, he hiccuped. I wanted to ride my bike down the big hill. Nathaniel winced, trying to sit straighter. He didn't know how fast it would go. He lost control and hit the curb. I caught him, but I landed wrong. Amara dropped to her knees beside them, inspecting his leg. It was already swelling, badly. I think it's just twisted, Nathaniel said, though his jaw was clenched. Stay still. She took over then, calm and precise, in a way that made the children quiet down instantly. She sent Nia for the ice pack and Miles for his brother's water bottle, and she lifted Ezra gently into her arms, pressing her forehead to his. You're okay. You're safe. Breathe, baby. Nathaniel watched her, still on the floor, feeling helpless in a way he hadn't expected. Ezra clung to her, whispering, He caught me. He didn't let go. Amara looked over at Nathaniel. Their eyes locked just for a second, and something in her face softened, but only slightly. She nodded toward the couch. Let me help you up. He didn't protest. It hurt more than he admitted, and she noticed. He sat stiffly, breath shallow, as she wrapped his ankle with a skill that didn't come from books, but from experience years of skinned knees, bumped heads, late-night fevers without help. You should get it looked at, she said. I'll be fine. You're limping like you fought a bear. He smiled weakly. Feels like I lost. She didn't return the smile, not fully, but she handed him a glass of water and sat across from him. I told you not to let them go down that hill. I didn't, he said. He took off before I could stop him. I'm not blaming you. But her voice carried something underneath it. Old fear, half buried. I've done this alone for so long, she continued. And for a while, the worst part was not having anyone to blame but myself when things went wrong. Nathaniel's gaze dropped to his lap. And now? He asked. Now, it's different. She didn't elaborate, didn't need to, because the room, with its scattered crayons and mismatched throw pillows, was no longer a museum of survival. It was becoming something else, something that required trust, shared responsibility. The terrifying weight of co-parenting is not out of obligation, but choice. And when that trust cracked, even for a second, it echoed. Later that night, after the kids were in bed, Nathaniel sat on the back porch, his leg propped up on a stool, the ice pack slowly melting through a dish towel. Amara joined him. She carried 2 mugs of tea cinnamon vanilla, still the same blend, though now it tasted more like habit than nostalgia. She handed him one and sat beside him, close enough for her knee to brush his uninjured one. For a while they said nothing. The crickets chirped in the darkness. The wind shifted, cool and fragrant with pine. Then Amara spoke. "I know you caught him." Nathaniel glanced sideways. "I know you didn't hesitate, that you probably got hurt worse because of it." He swallowed. "I'd do it 1,000 times over." "I know." She took a slow sip of her tea, then looked down into the cup as if it might help her find the right words. "Ezra told me you said something after, when you were holding him." Nathaniel blinked. "What did I say?" "You whispered, 'I won't let go.'" He stared out into the dark, ashamed of how quickly the tears rose. "I meant it." "I believe you," she said softly. And then, in a voice almost too quiet for the night to carry, "But if you ever do again, if you ever walk away, I won't explain it to them. I won't protect you from what that does. Not again." Nathaniel looked at her. This time, he didn't flinch. "I won't make you." She nodded once, then leaned back, her head resting against the wooden slats of the swing. The silence between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like the truth being given space to settle. The next morning, Ezra dressed in mismatched socks and proudly declared, "I think I'll walk to school today." Nathaniel, still stiff from the fall, grinned. Probably wise. Amara looked at them both from across the kitchen table, her arms folded, watching how Ezra leaned easily into Nathaniel's side, how Nathaniel braced himself when the boy bumped into his sore leg and didn't even wince. She met Nathaniel's eyes briefly, and this time the smile came, small, unspoken, but real. Because love, she was learning, wasn't always the second chance people begged for. Sometimes it was simply the choice to stay steady when everything else was moving too fast. It began with a phone call. Amara was folding Ezra's sweatshirt, still warm from the dryer, when her cell buzzed against the windowsill. The caller ID flashed a name she hadn't seen in years, but recognized instantly. Vivian Cole, Nathaniel's mother. She hesitated, her hands pressing a soft crease into cotton, the steady hum of the dryer rolling beneath the silence like a warning. The second buzz jolted her into motion. She picked it up, swiped. "Hello?" "Amara." "Good morning." Vivian's voice hadn't changed, smooth as aged velvet, with an undercurrent of authority that rarely waited for permission. "Hello, Vivian. I trust I'm not calling at a bad time." Amara didn't answer. Silence, she had learned, was often more potent than politeness. Vivian continued. "I'll be in Atlanta this weekend. I want to meet, face to face." "What for?" "I believe you deserve a few things said directly, and I would prefer we not use Nathaniel as a courier." It was not a request, and Amara knew enough to respect that, even if she didn't trust it. She agreed to meet at a quiet garden cafe 2 hours outside Willow Creek neutral ground. Saturday came cloudless and dry. Nathaniel offered to drive her, but she declined. Instead, she took her car, windows cracked, music low, her fingers tapping an uneven rhythm on the steering wheel. She wore a navy blouse, pressed and tucked neatly into dark jeans, casual but deliberate. She didn't dress for power. She dressed for the occasion. Vivian arrived precisely on time, slipping into the wrought iron chair opposite her with grace cultivated in marble foyers and political fundraisers. "You look well," Vivian began. Amara nodded once. "So do you." The waiter came and went. Water was poured. No one touched it. "I won't waste your time," Vivian said. "I know who you are to him. I knew even back then. And I didn't approve not because of your background, but because of his." Amara blinked. "I'm not sure I follow." Vivian folded her hands on the table. Nathaniel has always run from emotion, from permanence. You weren't the risk I was. He was terrified of becoming me. Amara stared at her, caught somewhere between disbelief and clarity. I thought keeping him away from you was a kindness, Vivian said. But I see now it was just control, dressed in motherly concern. That was never your decision, Amara said, her voice level. No, Vivian admitted, but I made it anyway. And now, he's undone all of it. There was no venom in her voice, no heat, just resignation. Amara exhaled slowly. Is this your way of asking me to let him go again? Vivian looked down at her napkin, then surprisingly shook her head. I'm not here to ask anything of you. I'm here because he's different now. And I needed to see what that looked like through your eyes. Silence. Then, do you love him? Amara didn't answer right away. She didn't fidget, didn't blink. But the truth lived in her stillness. I don't know if that word covers it, she said at last. Vivian smiled faintly. Then it's real. They sat in silence after that. When the check came, Vivian paid without fuss. As they stood, she reached into her purse and handed Amara a small photograph, worn, edges curling slightly. A boy, maybe 5 years old, standing in a park with messy hair and a red sweater too big for him. Nathaniel, Vivian said softly, the day after his father left. Amara took the photo, held it like something fragile. He never let himself cry that day. He just kept asking when dinner would be ready. A pause. I think he's still waiting for someone to answer that question. Back in Willow Creek, Amara walked through the front door just as the late sun began to slip behind the trees. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that lives only in homes where children have worn themselves out from joy. Nathaniel was at the kitchen table, helping Miles assemble a model of a historic schooner. He looked up when he saw her, cautious. Everything okay? She nodded. Where are the others? Nia's painting. Ezra's asleep in the sunroom. She stepped inside, set her bag down. He walked over to place the photograph on the table beside him. Nathaniel's eyes widened the moment he saw it. She gave this to you? She said it's the only photo she ever kept in her wallet. He picked it up and stared for a long time. I remember this sweater, he murmured. It was my dad's. Mom had to fold the sleeves thrice so I could wear them. She also said, you didn't cry. Nathaniel's throat moved. I didn't. Amara stood beside him, her fingers brushing the back of his shoulder. I think you've been waiting a long time to be allowed. To be what? To not be okay. He looked up at her then, eyes wet but clear. And in that moment, there was nothing performative between them. Just a man, a woman, and the unspoken history between them that no longer asked for perfection, only presence. That night, after the children were tucked into bed, the dishes were washed, and the lights dimmed, Amara stepped onto the back porch and found him there. She walked over, wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, her cheek resting lightly against his back. He reached for her hand, laced their fingers together. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Because some reconciliations don't come in the form of apologies. They come in the quiet choice to stay, to sit, to breathe, and to hold. What once felt impossible gently and without fear. A Friday afternoon, the rain falling steadily, as if winter were hesitating at autumn's threshold. Water streaked down the window pane, blurring the edges of the picture Nia had taped up last week. A watercolor painting of 3 children standing in a playground, beside a man in a brown coat with a bright smile. The man looked so much like Nathaniel, that Amara stood frozen at the window, still holding the towel she'd been folding. She had seen that image many times, the three children and him. But today, with the rain falling and the light outside turning hazy, something within her went still. Nathaniel was in the living room, sitting on the floor amidst scattered Legos and Miles's whispers about a homemade solar system. He had no idea that, from the hallway, the woman he had once walked away from was watching him again, not with anger nor suspicion, but with a kind of tenderness difficult to name, as if she were witnessing the maturing of a scar. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, Amara opened an old drawer in her study. Inside was a thin stack of paper, its edges yellowed with time. On top lay a letter unfinished, with no addressee. She sat down, her hand trembling slightly as she opened it. "I'm not writing this letter to make you come back," the first line began. The handwriting slanted like her voice back then. "I just don't know who else to say this to, but you." The letter had been written one September night, a few weeks after Nathaniel had vanished from their lives. Amara didn't remember how much hope she had poured into each sentence, only that she wrote to keep herself from falling apart when no one else was there to listen. "I used to think I was strong," another part read. "But strength doesn't mean not hurting. I don't blame you for leaving. I blame myself for believing that love would be enough." Amara read until the end. There was no closing line, no punctuation, just a blank space left open, like the ending they'd never had. She placed the letter down, intending to tuck it away, but something compelled her to carry it into the living room. Nathaniel was still awake, putting the last of the Lego pieces back into their box. "Do you remember the day I wrote this?" she asked, her voice so soft the breeze outside might have broken it. He looked up, slightly startled. "Which letter?" Amara sat across from him, laid the paper between them. Nathaniel read each line slowly. His expression tightened midway through, then softened by the final lines. When he looked up, something in his eyes had changed, an understanding deeper than regret, beyond shame. "I wish I had read it sooner," he said. "I'm not sure I wanted you to back then," she replied, her gaze lingering on the faint creases near his eyes. They fell quiet. Neither tried to fill the space between them with apologies. At last, Nathaniel said, "If you were to write that letter today, what would you say?" Amara looked at him. Her heart is no longer busy shielding itself. She only wanted to speak the truth. "I wouldn't write," she whispered. "I'd wait until you were brave enough to ask." He nodded. No rush, no defense. Then he stood and walked toward her, not with the hesitation of a man seeking forgiveness, but with the certainty of someone who finally knew what he was willing to protect. He didn't say, "I love you." She didn't respond with anything like, "I forgive you." But when his hand closed gently around hers, when the warmth between their fingertips spread into the quiet of the room, everything once unspeakable became a conversation without words. And sometimes, the letters we never sent make us realize the person meant to receive them had always been there. No stamp, no address. Just the courage to stay after everything. It was supposed to be just dinner, not an occasion, not a milestone. Just a Tuesday night with 3 kids chattering over spaghetti and mismatched plates, and 2 adults pretending that things hadn't changed beneath the surface of the mundane. But of course they had. It started with Naya. She wore a new turquoise headband with tiny stars embroidered across it, and came downstairs twirling like she was walking into her birthday party. "Do I look like a future fashion designer?" she asked, posing at the bottom of the stairs. Nathaniel, already in the kitchen stirring sauce, chuckled. "You look like someone who knows exactly who she is." "Good," she said, proud. "I do." Ezra followed with his hands covered in marker ink. green and red streaks up his forearms, like tribal paint. "I'm a jungle scientist," he announced. "And this," he held up a notebook filled with scribbles, "is my official wildlife log." Miles trailed last, quiet, his nose deep in a graphic novel, though he paused long enough to give Nathaniel a quick nod, the kind that spoke of quiet respect, now habitual. Amara stood by the doorway, arms crossed loosely over her chest, watching all of it with the smile that only came when she thought no one was looking. Nathaniel did. He noticed the softness around her eyes. She still pulled her hair into a loose bun while she cooked, leaving a single strand to fall at her temple. She let the kids interrupt each other at the table, choosing laughter over order. Dinner was loud, messy, joyful. Ezra dropped his fork twice. Nia insisted on reading aloud a poem she'd written, which rhymed galaxy with salad, see? And Miles muttered something about quantum particles being cooler than noodles. Nathaniel couldn't stop smiling. After the dishes were cleared and the children migrated to their various corners of the house, Amara poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to him as she leaned against the counter. "That went better than expected," she said. "You mean no food fights? No tears, spilled juice, or accusations of broccoli betrayal?" He laughed. "I like it here." Her expression didn't shift, but her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. "I know," she said. There was a long pause. Then, quietly, "I also know you don't plan to stay." Nathaniel turned to face her. "That's not true. You've got meetings lined up in San Francisco next week. A team is waiting in Zurich. A press tour for the AI division launching next quarter." He looked away, jaw tight. "I'm not leaving because I want to." Amara studied him. "But you are leaving." There was no accusation in her voice, only resignation. He exhaled. "I haven't figured out how to stay without losing everything I've built." She nodded slowly. "You haven't figured out how to stay without losing yourself." Nathaniel set his glass down, untouched. The weight of her words sat heavier than any confession he could offer. "I thought success would feel like something solid," he murmured, "like a mountain under my feet. But every time I reach another summit, it's just more sky. And now I think maybe the only thing that's ever felt like ground was you." Amara didn't move, didn't speak, just let him stand in that truth. The clock ticked above the sink. Outside, a train passed in the distance, its low hum stretching through the night. "I was scared," he said. "Still am." She turned to face him fully. "Of what?" "Of being needed here. Of failing here. Of not knowing how to hold a life that isn't made of contracts and quarterly reports." Amara stepped closer, just enough to erase the space that felt like caution. "You already are holding it," she said. "You just haven't decided if you're brave enough to keep it." He swallowed hard. "I want to." She touched his arm. Light, measured. "You don't have to say that tonight." "But I do." His voice cracked. "Because every time I leave this house, even just to run to the store, I find myself wishing I didn't have to. Wishing I could stop buying time and start choosing it." They stood there, unsure how to end the moment without breaking it. Then Nia's voice echoed down the hall. "Mom, can I use your tablet to look up designs for my fashion project?" Amara stepped back, gently. "In the basket on the shelf, baby," she called. Nathaniel watched her walk to the living room, watched the ease with which she returned to mothering, to anchoring. He looked down at his glass, now warming in his hand, untouched. When she came back, her eyes searched his. "I'm not asking for promises," she said. "Just presence." And this time, Nathaniel didn't respond with words. He just reached out fingertips to fingertips and let his touch answer what language had always complicated. Dinner had ended hours ago, but something else was beginning, something not measured in meals or gestures, something that asked only one thing: stay. Not forever, just here, just now. And that could be enough. The morning came with the scent of rain still clinging to the soil, even though the sky had cleared and the sun shone through the kitchen windows with unapologetic warmth. Amara was already at the sink, rinsing blueberries for the kids' cereal, humming quietly under her breath, an old Billie Holiday tune her mother used to sing. Nathaniel stood in the doorway. He wasn't sure how long he'd been watching her. 5 seconds. A lifetime. There was a softness to her when she moved through the quiet of morning, a kind of practiced grace that didn't ask for attention but held it anyway. She wasn't aware he was there yet. Her shoulders relaxed, fingers delicate around the ceramic bowl. And in that stillness, he realized something he couldn't name. He didn't want to leave. Not just the house, not just the town. He didn't want to leave her, or the way her presence softened the sharpest corners of him. "Are you sure about Zurich?" she asked over coffee on the back porch. He blinked, surprised. "How did you talk in your sleep sometimes," she said with a small smile. "Mostly about flight schedules and meeting decks." He ran a hand through his hair, a sheepish chuckle escaping. "Occupational hazard." "So?" He didn't answer right away. "I'm supposed to leave next week." "That's not what I asked." He looked across the yard, where Ezra was trying to catch butterflies with a mason jar and a sock tied to a stick. Miles sat nearby with a book half opened in his lap, pretending not to be interested in helping. And Nia, in her ever-growing confidence, had created a makeshift runway in the grass using garden stones and was now strutting down it in her rain boots like they were designer heels. "I don't know how to stay," Nathaniel admitted. "Yes, you do," Amara said gently. "You just don't know who you are without the leaving." The words hung like smoke, quiet, curling, unmistakable. He leaned back in his chair. "I built an empire thinking I needed to outrun something." "And did you?" "No," he said, "but I lost track of what I was chasing." She sipped her coffee, then looked over at him, not with pressure, not with expectation, but with something else entirely. Curiosity. "You once told me you didn't believe in permanence," she said. He nodded. "Because nothing in my childhood ever was. Every place, every person, every promise, it all ended. So I figured I couldn't be abandoned if I never stood still." Amara tilted her head, watching him as if seeing something beyond the man sitting there. "And now?" Nathaniel's gaze shifted to the yard again, to the children he hadn't known long enough to feel entitled to, but had grown to love as if he always had. To the woman who had carried them, raised them, and still somehow made space for him without asking him to be anything but honest. "Now I think, maybe stillness isn't the enemy. Maybe it's the invitation." She smiled, barely. "Then you're closer than you think." That night, after the kids had gone to bed and the wind had picked up just enough to make the porch chimes sing, Nathaniel sat alone at the dining table with a stack of old journals Amara had left out, thin, spiral-bound, the kind you'd find in a back-to-school aisle. Curiosity got the better of him. He opened the first one. Instead of diary entries, inside were notes about the children, little moments she had written down. Ezra's first word, apple. Nia's favorite made-up song about clouds, and Miles's obsession with drawing rocket ships after watching a documentary on Mars. There were sketches, 2 stick figures with wild hair and crooked houses labeled home. And in the margins, scattered between memories, were short thoughts. He would have loved this moment. "I wish he could see her dance. I am tired. But still, I choose love. He closed the journal softly, as if afraid to wake it, and suddenly, the shape of her years without him became real, not theoretical, not something he could brush off with regret or guilt, but real in the ink she used to survive them. He stood, walked down the hall, and paused outside her bedroom door. It was cracked open, and she was inside, reading by lamplight, glasses sliding slightly down the bridge of her nose. She didn't look up when he knocked gently, but she said, "I was wondering when you'd come in." He stepped through the doorway, stood by the bookshelf, ran his fingers along the spines of titles he remembered her loving: Baldwin, Morrison, Audre Lorde. "I read your journals," he said quietly. She didn't react, just turned a page. "You left them out for a reason, didn't you?" She finally looked up. "Not to guilt you, to show you what living looked like when you weren't here." He nodded, slowly. "It was beautiful," he said, "and it made me wish I had been braver." She closed the book. "You were surviving. So was I. I'm tired of surviving." That made her pause. "I want to live," he said. "Live. Not in hotel rooms or airport lounges. Not in meetings. I forget the minute they're done. I want to be here, not just visiting, not just fixing what I broke, but building what's next." She studied him for a long moment, then said, almost softly, "So stay." A silence followed, but it wasn't the hesitant kind anymore. It was the kind that follows truth. He stepped closer, sat on the edge of her bed, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a guest in his desire. She reached for his hand, not as a promise, not as a final answer, but as a beginning. And in the dim lamplight, with nothing but the sound of her steady breath and the faint rustle of wind through the trees outside, Nathaniel realized, sometimes love isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or declarations. Sometimes it waits, quietly, faithfully, until you stop running. By the time winter settled gently over the rooftops of Laurel Creek, the garden behind Amara's house had long gone to sleep. The hydrangeas had curled in on themselves, the tomato vines brittle and brown, yet standing tall like monuments to the seasons passing through this place. Nathaniel had stayed, not in the way of sudden declarations or grand reinventions, but in the quiet, persistent way water softens stone. He stayed through the morning school runs, the mismatched socks, the PTA meetings that tested his patience more than corporate boardrooms ever could. He stayed through flu season and Ezra's first piano recital, through Miles finally letting him help build a model spacecraft without triple-checking every instruction, through Nia's insistence that he be the dad guest in her class on career day. And Amara. Amara watched it all without ever demanding anything from him, because she didn't need to. One night in mid-January, while the kids were at a neighbor's sleepover and the fire in the living room had burned low, they sat across from each other on the floor, her legs curled beneath her. His body leaned forward, elbows resting on knees. There was no music, no clinking glasses, just the hush of a home that no longer felt temporary. "I had a dream last night," she said in a low voice. "Oh," he asked, watching her. "You were in it, but it wasn't you, now you from 10 years ago. You were sitting on that bench outside the train station, where you left." He inhaled slowly. "And what was I doing?" he asked. "Reading," she replied. "Same book you were carrying the day we met." But in the dream, every page was blank. A beat of silence. "I think that's what it felt like," she added, "after you left. Like all the stories we were supposed to write together had been erased before they began." He looked down, then back up. "And now?" She hesitated, then smiled. "Now it's like we're writing something different. Not what I imagined. Not what you imagined, but something real. Nathaniel reached for her hand, and this time, it felt effortless. There were still questions. There were still nights when he woke up wondering if he was enough, if the pieces he brought were too jagged to fit the life he'd returned to. But every time he doubted, Amara's steadiness, her unshaken faith in the ordinary beauty of shared mornings and uneven roads, grounded him. She didn't want to be perfect. She never had. She wanted presence. And slowly, he had learned that presence isn't about being everything. It's about being there when it's complicated or inconvenient. When silence feels heavy, and when joy surprises you in the middle of folding laundry. Spring came, and with it, the garden woke up again. The kids helped replant the herbs and vegetables, and Nia drew tiny signs in glitter markers: basil, thyme, and lavender. Ezra insisted they grow strawberries, because strawberries mean summer. Miles oversaw the operation like a quiet architect, checking soil levels excessively. Nathaniel found an old wooden bench at a yard sale and refinished it himself over a week. When it was done, he placed it at the far end of the yard beneath the sycamore tree, where light dappled through leaves in the late afternoon. One evening, after dinner, Amara joined him there. They sat side by side, hands brushing, neither speaking for a while. Then she turned slightly, resting her head on his shoulder. "Do you miss it?" she asked softly. The pace, the power. He didn't need time to answer. "I thought I would," he said. "But I don't. Not really. Not even a little." He smiled. "Only when the coffee maker here breaks down, and I have to wait for someone to fix it, instead of calling a hotel concierge." She laughed, a sound he had once feared he'd never hear again. And it settled somewhere in his chest, like a song he hadn't known he missed until it played again. "I'm proud of you," she said. He turned to her, surprised. "For what?" "For not running," she replied. "And for showing our kids that healing isn't just something that happens, it's something you work for." He didn't say anything at first, just took her hand and traced his thumb along her knuckles. "There's something else," he murmured. "Something I've been thinking about." Amara tilted her head. "I'd like to take your last name." The words caught her off guard. She stared at him, searching his face, unsure if he was joking. "You mean?" "I mean it," he said. "Not for appearances, not for some legal gesture, but because I want to live every day reminded of what brought me back to life." Her throat tightened. "You already do," she whispered. He leaned forward and then pressed his forehead to hers. And in that soft, trembling moment, no rings, vows, or orchestras were playing in grand halls. Just the earth beneath them, the laughter of children from the porch, and the scent of lavender, newly planted. They had lost years, but they had found what mattered. And from that, something unshakable had begun to grow. What stays is not always what arrives first. Sometimes, what stays is what survives silence, distance, and fear. Sometimes, what stays is what chooses you again, and again, and again. The evening air in Laurel Creek had a softness that only came in late spring, when the days stretched longer, but the light still felt gentle, like it was careful not to wake what had taken so long to bloom. On the house's wraparound porch, that had once held only Amara and the laughter of 3 growing children, Nathaniel sat on the wooden swing, his fingers intertwined with hers. They weren't speaking. They didn't need to. Inside, a jazz record played low. Ella Fitzgerald's voice like velvet drifting through the open windows. Nia had fallen asleep in the hallway with a sketch pad on her chest. Ezra had finally caught a butterfly and insisted on naming it Sir Wings-a-Lot, now resting beside his bed in a carefully ventilated jar. Miles had fallen asleep reading, his glasses askew, the same book Nathaniel had once gifted him, now soft and worn at the corners. The house no longer felt like something borrowed. It felt lived in and loved, earned. Nathaniel looked at Amara, her profile illuminated by the porch light, a single curl resting against her cheek. "I never thought love would return to me," he said quietly. She smiled without turning. Love didn't come back. It never left her. He leaned in and kissed her temple. There had been no dramatic reconciliation, no cinematic declarations in the rain, just a few days of choosing again, conversations without armor, hands held through disagreements, silence filled not with resentment, but understanding. Forgiveness, he had learned, was not a single act. It was a discipline. And love not a rescue, but a return. A return to what mattered. A return to who he was when he stopped trying to be everything else. In the corner of the porch sat a small wooden box, the kind used to store garden gloves or loose nails. But inside it, Amara had placed the journals. Not to hide them, but to keep them close. Alongside them, there was now a new one. The first page was already filled in with Nathaniel's handwriting. May 22nd. Today, Nia made Ezra a crown out of dandelions, and he wore it for 3 hours. Miles explained the concept of time dilation over breakfast. Amara danced in the kitchen when she thought I wasn't looking. I love this life. I love the stillness. I love her. Amara had read it earlier that morning. She hadn't said a word. But when he kissed her neck while she washed dishes, she leaned into him with the certainty that only comes when trust is rebuilt, not overnight, but inch by inch. A breeze picked up, rustling the wind chimes gently, echoing into the quiet dark. Nathaniel shifted on the swing. "Do you ever think about the life we could have had if I hadn't left?" She thought for a moment. Then, "Sometimes. And I think we would have loved each other too fast, burned too bright, and maybe missed what was worth waiting for." He nodded. "I think you're right." She looked at him then, fully. "This version of us," she said. "It's slower, wiser, maybe even softer, but it's strong." He brought her hand to his lips, and it's home. In the silence that followed, something unspoken passed between them, a vow not sealed by law, not dependent on rituals or ceremonies, but etched into the very rhythm of their lives together. Not perfect, but present. And that, in the end, had become everything. As the stars blinked awake one by one, and the porch lights hummed their warm glow, the swing creaked beneath their weight. Two people, one long journey, a love neither expected to rewrite, but had anyway. A love that did not arrive in grand gestures, but in returning and remaining, and growing where once all that remained was silence. If this story found a quiet place in your heart, if it reminded you that love, even when lost, can find its way back through gentleness, courage, and truth, then don't forget to like, comment on your favorite moment, and follow our channel for more tender tales like this. Because sometimes, the most potent stories, they are the ones who begin again.